Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fifth lecture in our Out in the World, Ireland's LGBTQ plus diaspora series. And tonight, your host is my colleague, our historian in residence here at the museum, Dr. Maurice Casey. Maurice?
Thank you very much, Nathan. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you're having a nice evening in the winter cold, and I hope you're all able to get Garth Brooks tickets this morning. So this, as Nathan mentioned, is the fifth lecture in our series as part of our exhibition Out in the World. I am Maurice Casey. I was the curator and researcher for the exhibition. And as always with these talks, I want to just note at the start that you can feel free to drop any questions in the YouTube chat as well, and we will hopefully get around to them in the Q&A. So our talk this evening is a conversation on the future of Ireland's LGBTQ plus past. And before I briefly frame our discussion, I would like to quickly mention our charity partner for this series, Shout Out, who do amazing work in delivering education programs to improve the lives of LGBTQ plus people in Ireland. Thanks to you all who've dropped a donation to Shout Out as well when you registered for our talk this evening. So then, framing this discussion, recent years have seen a welcome wave of Irish LGBTQ plus history course through Irish research, museums, and public knowledge. In part, we might trace this interest to that particular referendum in May of 2015 that made international headlines. And yet this upsurge in interest has also drawn momentum from pioneers in the history of gender and sexuality in Ireland, and responds also to a sort of longue durée societal shifts brought about by the hard work of generations of activists, both at home and in the diaspora. And our exhibition Out in the World here at EPIC is just one part of a tapestry of projects that are weaving a new understanding of Ireland's past into the public consciousness around the island. Yet, I guess in relative terms, Ireland's LGBTQ plus history is still in its early years of development and may even be at something of a crossroads. Pioneers in telling these stories, including the activists who preserve their own history and the literary scholars who are among the first to develop the field, no longer work alone. There's a lot of talented postgraduates, postdocs, and early career researchers, in addition to historically minded members of the community itself, who are all digging deep into these stories too. Recovered voices and new approaches are complicating each strand of this history, so much so that we really need to speak of Irish queer histories in the plural, because the various complexities of Irish identity and history have shaped the transformation of Irish sexuality in complex ways. So, to explore all of this in more detail, the question at the center of our discussion this evening is a deceptive one, because although it doesn't take long to ask, we could spend the whole night attempting to answer it. What is the future of Ireland's LGBTQ plus past? So joining me in diving into the depths of this question are two brilliant scholars who are part of shaping the future of this scholarship. Abigail Fletcher is a PhD candidate, tutor, and Justin Arbuthnot scholar at the University of Edinburgh. Her doctoral project examines the relationship between state, society, and sexuality in Northern Ireland from partition in 1921 to the 1982 decriminalisation of male homosexuality. She has also produced research on LGBT activism in Northern Ireland, 82 to 2002. Dr. Patrick McDonagh is the author of Gay and Lesbian Activism in the Republic of Ireland, 1973 to 93, recently published by Bloomsbury Academic. His research primarily focuses on gay and lesbian activism in the latter half of the 20th century in Ireland, and he obtained his PhD in history from the European University Institute in 2019. So thank you both for joining me. So to begin, a kind of a broad question for you both, and I'm going to be, and Abigail, you can be the first to answer it. I'd like you both to tell me one story that you think is yet to be told from this history.
Thank you, Maurice, and thanks for the very kind introduction. I'm going to be annoying and say that I think there are quite a lot of stories, as I think the theme of the evening will be things in plural. Yeah, that's a really interesting question to think about. And I'd say that the problem with this is there are so many stories of Irish LGBTQ plus history we haven't even yet thought about. I, for one, am most fascinated really by life histories, by the subjective and biographical accounts of queer people's experiences that reveal more than any court record or newspaper could tell us. And those are the sources that I've primarily been working with so far in my research. I also think that the present lack of focus on histories of bisexuality, lesbianism, trans lives and experiences, and those outside of urban centres like Belfast and Dublin needs to be corrected, as these are so essential to enhancing and expanding our understanding of Ireland's LGBTQ+ history. At the same time, as an historian of homosexuality in Northern Ireland, I find almost quite frustratingly that the framework for those more nuanced accounts is almost entirely lacking in the existing records. We're only just starting to think about what made LGBTQ+ life the way that it was, and in many ways has remained north of the border, and detailing this beyond very one-dimensional religious explanations. My own work sort of seeks to start some of this process by critically analysing the delay in law reform until 1982 and fusing this analysis with an account of the society and culture that either inhibited or sometimes promoted this at certain points in the 20th century. So I think the real answer is that there are lots of stories. I can't pinpoint just one, I'm afraid.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Abigail, and a lot there to think about. Patrick, I'll come to you, same question.
Yeah, hi everyone, and absolutely, Abigail, I think you're right on the money there. There's an awful lot of stories to be told. I mean, if you were to offer me funding tomorrow and access to any archive that I could get access to, and not to be starting on a negative topic, but one issue which kind of stuck with me after my research was the extent to which there was some form of conversion therapy practiced in Ireland throughout the 20th century. You know, there's some reference to it in the 1970s. The issue is, or the challenge with looking at that history is access to sources, right? But I do think there is a story there, and that there should be some exploration of that topic, because it's kind of to the margins or slightly ignored at the moment. But as you know, we do have a history of institutionalizing people in this country, and some of the bits that I've come across do make reference to curing homosexuality in Ireland. So for me, that would be one area that I would love to explore more, whether or not it's possible. At the moment, I'm not so sure. There's an interesting project I think that the Royal Irish Academy is doing in Grange Gorman. So that would be one area or one, I suppose, hospital that would be really worth looking at and seeing what was going on there. But yeah. And again, not to be negative, but I do think it's a very important story that does need to be looked at and explored in much further detail.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think as well, kind of coming back to you, Patrick, and jumping off of that, something you mentioned yesterday in the excellent Department of Justice seminar, which I encourage everyone here to check out the recording of, was positive stories. And telling positive stories. And I'm wondering, and this is a question for you both, but I'll begin with Patrick, where are we going to find those as well, those stories that maybe take us away from a history of criminalization and towards history of expression and empowerment and so on?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. And one thing which struck me when I was listening to Mary McAuliffe yesterday and Avril Earls was particularly, I suppose, Mary's part on the relationships that she's discovered of Irish revolutionary females. And okay, well, they mightn't have been openly, we say, accepted as a couple or in a relationship. I do still think there's something quite empowering and positive about those relationships, you know, that they were able to put messages on their gravestones, which, you know, in some way reference their relationships. But I suppose more recently then, and sources which I think are really worth looking at are some of the gay publications in the 1970s and 1980s, and particularly the personal advertisements can be really quite revealing in terms of a more positive maybe story. And particularly around those who are looking to explore their fetishes, right? So if you look at some of the stories, you're looking at it and thinking, God, this is in 1980s Ireland. And you can often think that, you know, that this was just not to be talked about, fetishes, you know, let alone just sexual intercourse, with somebody writing in and looking for somebody in leather or somebody who's quite dominant And the fact that they were most likely finding these people engaging in this activity, I find that quite empowering, because we have this notion still that, you know, was very much a stigma associated with sexuality, but there were those who were willing to explore those sides of their sexuality. And in, you know, these magazines were available, right? They were available in Eastons and throughout the country, and the fact that they're here and sending in those letters, I find quite empowering and somewhat more positive that they were able to, you know, explore this side of their sexuality. And I think they're a great source, these personal ads, and they tell us a lot more. And just in terms of you know, looking outside Dublin, you know, I read about this group in Clonmel in the 1980s, and I think it's one of the funniest stories. And it kind of took me by surprise. And again, it's probably my ignorance. You often make assumptions about, you know, the urban-rural divide. But in the 1980s in Clonmel, there was a group meeting in hotels, and an individual used to come and bring merchandise like dildos and so on. And you're thinking, wow, that's amazing that that's happening in the 1980s in, you know, rural Ireland. So yeah, there's I think there's any snippets there of some positive stories that we still to recover and tell.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. There's so much there. And I guess then coming to Abigail as well, thinking also of these kind of positive stories in your research, what are you kind of finding?
Yeah, I would echo everything Patrick said there, and I think publications are a really lovely into that, and especially in the North, some of those early publications from the 70s, like the Gay Liberation Information Sheet and Migrant News, there's some really fascinating but quite joyful and entertaining examples of poetry and reclaiming history, and people just looking for a good time as well. And I think a lot of that really gets written out of this record. At the same time, I think it is also like an attitude thing. So I work with a lot of court records, which are quite under-examined for Northern Ireland. And I think as much as those are very partial sources, and they do reflect obviously the criminality and the criminal status of homosexual acts, at the same time, some of those witness statements are incredibly rich, and you can get sort of particular men who are really quite vivid in their descriptions of their partner and in the relationship. And I think that's something that's really important to foreground in these, as much as we're sort of reflecting the fact that they were persecuted for their acts and for their sexuality, also sort of trying to build the picture of the life beyond that, and sort of focusing on the positive. One really positive narrative that I found in my early research on cross-border activism was really that in itself, sort of these friendships and this collaboration between activists in different parts of Ireland, sort of overcoming very similar circumstances of their criminal status, but also sort of the fact that in both parts of Ireland, you know, the religious fundamentalism and all of that sort of stuff. I think some of the relationships between groups like Gay Community Fellowship and Reach in the South are really empowering and uplifting histories of sort of the men at the time and the women at the time being able to forge friendships in spite of very difficult circumstances.
Thanks. So there's kind of two themes that I want to draw out from what you guys are talking about there. Particularly, I'll come back to Abigail, that idea of the two different jurisdictions and how they shape this history in the different ways that the border exists in this history and does not exist. But I guess what I want to come to first is this idea of sources, which I think is going to also be a recurring theme in this conversation and in all conversations like it. We're talking about publications, right? But like, when did these begin, do you think? Is it the 60s, the 70s that we can try to look at these publications, or can we read other sources against the grain in an earlier period? Abigail, I thought this was interesting, what you were suggesting about the criminal records themselves are sources of agency read a certain way, right? And what ways might we be able to reread sources from the early 20th century, maybe to recover that agency also? Are there other sources you think that we can find that agency in, particularly in the early 20th century, before we get this publication culture that emerges later?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Maurice. And I think as much as that publication culture is really rich and really worth studying, it can be quite difficult when we start to shift the lens sort of pre-1970s. And that's something I've struggled with in my own research. I think, again, it is a matter of perspective and it's reading sources against the grain. But a lot of the approaches we can use are similar to sort of what Mary McAuliffe spoke about yesterday in the seminar when we're trying to retrieve women's LGBTQ plus history. So looking at really taking quite inventive approaches to personal records, diaries, memoirs, wills, death notices, all of that kind of thing, and rereading those and looking for evidence of LGBTQ plus experience and agency within them. So again, it's difficult, but I think it's also part of the reason why it's so important that more people are working on this, because as much as I think the activist records are really rich and really worth studying, and I feel very fortunate to have the opportunity to do that, it does take quite a lot of work and quite a lot of resources when we start looking at the earlier period.
Mm-hmm. And Patrick, you something as well that you mentioned yesterday and that I wanted to bring up today as well was the kind of the bar of evidence that are we setting too high a bar of evidence for these relationships when we would, see a heterosexual relationship or a woman and a man cohabiting in history and just assume and never have to make the case to say these were a couple. Everyone would just be like, yes, okay, of course, they lived together, they were a couple. Do you think that there is a bar that we need to, I don't want to say lower a bar, but do we need to, introduce an element of accepting speculation and accepting a limit of the archive in terms of recovering this history across the 20th century?
Absolutely. And, I remember I was at a conference one time and I was struck by something Orla Egan said, and the penny almost dropped, that it's this idea that we are, as I suppose, as queer historians or whatever you want to call us, expected to present irrefutable proof that we just do not apply to heterosexual relationships. And that's why I was particularly struck by what Mary McAuliffe was saying yesterday. And it's how we approach these particular relationships and, questioning the terminology used and I suppose bringing a queer lens to it. So she talks about some of the terms used, like lifelong companion and other terms like that. And it's I suppose it's going beyond that and saying, okay, well, is there something there that, if we were to look at it with queer lens, and we'd say, well, actually, there clearly was something more than just maybe friendship. And, she talked about somebody exhuming a body, and Mary was saying, like, I wouldn't do that for a friend. And she's right. You wouldn't go to those lengths for just a friend. Some might, but, the majority probably wouldn't. And I think we do place too much of a burden on ourselves as historians to have this irrefutable proof. And I almost think okay, if we were wrong with one or two, is it such a bad thing to just, it's. We assume everyone is heterosexual as if that's a good thing. But if we were to make a mistake and say, well, actually, they weren't, in a relationship, it's somehow a bad thing. So I do think we place too much pressure on ourselves to have this proof. And I think we need to move beyond that, a bit of common sense almost would kind of help a lot to say, well, yeah, there's a lot more going on here than just friendship, for example. Yeah. So I think you're right on the money there.
Yeah, and I think it's also, about expanding our ideas of human relationships and so on. I think that Sonia Tiernan writes about this in her work on Eva Gore Booth and Esther Roper, that there is no smoking gun, where one of them writes a letter and says, thank you for the great sexual relationship that we have. But actually, it doesn't matter, right? They had an extremely close, intimate bond, and that in itself is important. Whether or not they slept together, it's irrelevant. It's immaterial to the discussion that we can have through these two people about what the ways that people bonded in the past. I guess kind of sticking on sources as well, I wanted to ask you, is there a surprising place that you found a source, right? And I'll begin, I guess, so that you kind of think about this question, to come up with like a surprising place where you found this history. Two examples. One was looking again at the letters page of what was then called a homophile publication in the US in the 1960s, One magazine, and seeing this letter sent from Connemara in 1962 by someone who had lived a gay life in America and then had returned to Ireland. And you could look at the dates and you could see that this person had emigrated in 1920 and had lived a gay life in the US in the 20s and the 30s and had then returned to Ireland. And that was kind of a penny drop moment as well, where I thought, if I look at the international press, actually, I can find Ireland being discussed and I can find Irish people. Or, of course, the kind of story I always tell is of Gavin Arthur, who was the bisexual grandson of the 21st US president, who showed up in Dublin in the 1920s. And that, again, was like something that's emerging, I guess, in a few different research projects, are the perspectives of visitors, of LGBTQ plus visitors to Ireland, and how they can tell us something about how they navigated Dublin and what they found in Dublin. So that's kind of the question. What's a surprising place that you found sources, and where should people interested in going beyond the sort of usual route of sources look? Whoever wants to jump in.
That's a really good question, and it's actually a valuable way of looking at this, because there can be some quite obvious places to go. I unfortunately haven't been surprised too often so far in my research, but I will say one example from what I've done recently that I found really interesting. It's maybe common knowledge among people who do study homosexuality in the North, but the unionist politician H. Montgomery Hyde, who in the 1950s was a proponent of homosexual law reform, was actually deselected as an MP for North Belfast. Partially because of that, when I went through the records of his sort of constituency association, I was expecting to find sort of predictable sort of iterations of unionist opposition to it. And one really quite fascinating letter I found that was sent to the secretary was sort of this handwritten threatening note about sort of threatening all the force of Satan on the Unionist Association if they weren't to reinstate Hyde to his position. So this kind of idea that it's an anonymous letter, it may or may not have been a supporter of him as a politician, but just this idea that there could have been someone vocalizing in quite a, I mean, I found it amusing, but quite a unique way, articulating these ideas in favor of homosexuality at that time in Northern Ireland, because oftentimes the evidence in the obvious places is very much the opposite of that.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, one of the sources which kind of surprised me the most, and again, it's probably this whole idea that, anything outside, of the big cities, you're not good. It's very conservative. But I found the likes of some provincial newspapers to be a great source, and particularly in Galway. So the likes of the Galway Advertiser, the Connacht Tribune, Connacht Sentinel, and the Mayo News were really good examples, or sources, to kind of reveal what was happening in Galway in the 1980s. Like, I was shocked to find an advertisement for the Irish gay rights movement in the Mayo News, in the early 1980s. I hadn't seen that sort of an advertisement outside of the Mayo News. And, in the Galway Advertiser as well in 1985, there's a lovely letter from somebody who talks about coming to terms with their homosexuality, and it's printed there in the Galway Advertiser. And the Galway Advertiser as well, allowed the Galway Gay Collective to advertise their meetings and their group. And you often hear in Dublin how, and in Cork, that these organisations ran into difficulty with local press getting their organisations advertised. But here in Galway, a much smaller city at the time, and particularly Mayo as well, these organisations are being advertised. So to me, that was really quite surprising. And as a culture, I was delighted to see it as well, right? Because, we can often get a bad rep. So this was great for me to see, and it was a great way to get an insight into what was happening in Galway as well in the 1980s.
And I think what the kind of common thread through both of your answers there is this idea that to really expand this history, we need to first unlearn our assumptions and then proceed from that basis. Because I think, H. Montgomery Hyde points to what someone like me might be at risk of falling into, which is like presuming that the radical position, or like an emancipatory position, begins with the most radical socialist activists alive in this time. But no, it can come from a unionist, right? And that can be surprising to people, but it's very important that we recognize, and that's part of the diversity of this history as well, right? Not just in terms of different identities, in terms of sexuality, but political identities and how diverse those were. So I guess kind of sticking with Montgomery Hyde in a way and unionism, we're going to talk about the border, right? And talk about these two jurisdictions. And Patrick, your book, A Republic of Ireland, is in the title. And why? So basically my question is, why did you focus on this jurisdiction? Why did it make sense for you to use this as the framework of the history you were going to tell?
I suppose very easily, I suppose with the time period I want to look at, I wanted to finish in decriminalisation, but I also didn't think that I could do justice to looking at both jurisdictions, because there is such a big history there. And even in my book, I don't even go into half of what's actually happened in this particular period of time. So for me, my focus was on the Republic, because again, one, I wanted to expand outside Dublin and look at Galway and Cork. And I wasn't convinced I could get everything done in 4 years if I was to include Northern Ireland as well, if I'm being honest. So it was, I suppose, from a practical point of view, this was manageable in the time that I had. And I felt that there was a lot to be told from the perspective of the Republic of Ireland. And I suppose there was different trajectories as well, right? You know, the decriminalisation happens at a different time. And while I wanted to move away from that, it was kind of a nice timeline to kind of work towards, and to, I suppose, deconstruct what else was happening in the Republic at that time. So that was probably the main reasons that but that's not to say now that Northern Ireland doesn't come into the book as well, because, you know, in the first chapter, you know, I make the point that you cannot understand the rise of the gay rights movement in Ireland without looking at the cross-border support in 1973 in particular, and 1974, which ultimately led to the rise of the Irish gay rights movement in July 1974. Those cross-border interactions were extremely important, as were the involvement of organisations in the United Kingdom. So Northern Ireland is, and activists and organisations in Northern Ireland do feature in the book quite a bit. But yeah.
Yeah. And I guess that leads us kind of nicely into asking you, Abigail, about your work on Northern Ireland and where you see those cross-border exchanges and flows being important to the development of the history in the North.
Yeah, thank you. And Patrick's already kind of mentioned it, but so my undergraduate research was actually on activism, and there was sort of the main thrust of that really was looking at cross-border stuff, because primarily, I mean, it kind of came very naturally, because at the time when I was starting this research in about 2018, the only stuff that had really been published on activism on the island of Ireland was all on the Republic by both of yourselves at the time. So I found that a really good springboard, and it just naturally happened that I was working with the Irish Queer Archive, and I used that sort of to search for evidence of activism in the North at the time. So that was something that came really naturally for me. At the same time, I think there are so many comparisons, and it's quite hard to look at, particularly Northern Ireland, because of the jurisdictional link with the United Kingdom, and the fact that it's not included in 1967 is quite, it sort of seems like something very obvious to me. So it's very hard to look at Northern Ireland just as itself, because there are so many other influences. And of course, Europe is a really big dimension for both parts of Ireland where decriminalisation is concerned. So first of all, it's these kind of parallel decriminalisation narratives, and I think they're really important to consider. At the same time, one of my supervisors, Dr. Gail Davis, has done an awful lot of work on Scotland, and I keep finding comparisons there, because it was another place that wasn't included in the Sexual Offences Act at Westminster. But again, I mean, Patrick, your own work has revealed a lot of this sort of transnational nature, even of university activism, and the fact that sort of the Scottish Minorities Group was very involved with activists in the North. So I think it is an inherently quite comparative history. It's really hard to write this just thinking about one place. But again, I would say that's quite a historiographical thing, the fact that this history in the South is more developed. So I've always looked at that because it feels more relevant to Northern Ireland than a lot of the histories of Britain, because obviously the narrative there plays out so differently. So it's something I think is quite inherent in the history of it, and it's really hard to look at it as just one country, because there's so much else going on, and so many influences at work there. Even I think we're just starting to think about how many transnational links there are, and how sort of both, the Irish queer community is very much a part of a much more global project. And really influenced by so many other places. So that's something that's quite exciting, I think, for the future of research, starting to tease those out much more precisely than we already have.
The idea as well, I was reminded of in thinking through the idea of comparing us to other countries and so on, is this thing that we discussed before, which I think is kind of an important point to raise, which is that both of you did your PhDs outside of Ireland. And to me, I'm wondering why, firstly, because I also did my PhD outside of Ireland, though it's on a separate topic to this history. And why is that? And is there kind of, I guess, a lag behind the kind of institutional support for these histories and the public interest that there is in these histories?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I think you're right on the money there. In my own case, I was quite fortunate in the sense that I found a great supervisor in Ireland, and it just so happened that the European University came up as well, and it was quite an exciting opportunity. So that's why I suppose I went there. But I do believe that, and again, I'm talking particularly about our history departments here in the Republic, that they're massively behind, and that's my own personal perspective. I just can't think of somebody, in these institutions who are, we'll say, pioneering research in this history. I think a lot of it is happening outside history departments, and a lot of this history really has been discussed and uncovered by people not associated with any academic institution in Ireland. And, we owe them a great debt of gratitude, like the likes of Orla Egan, Tony Walsh, Sarah Phillips, who've been really, highlighting this important area of Irish history. So I think there's a lot of catching up to do within our history departments, and to give this history the importance that it deserves, because it is very important. And you look at Ireland in recent years, and you cannot understand that transformation without looking at the activists, particularly the gay organisations and the role that they've played. Marriage equality did not happen overnight. That you can trace back these efforts to the 1970s and so on. But there's a long way to go there. But it's great to see the likes of what's happening in Queen's University Belfast, that there's a wonderful project there. And it'd be great to see more of that. And that's not to say that there's not work in this area in Irish institutions, but it's not within the history departments, right? I don't think there's a real an appreciation just yet of the importance of this history within the history departments. But yeah, that's just my own personal perspective.
Abigail, what do you think?
Yeah, I would echo what Patrick said, and I do think it is an interesting observation that so much of Irish queer history about Ireland is taking place outside of Ireland, and I think we should think about that. Like Patrick's mentioned, I think the HRC project happening at Queen's and Ulster is a really fantastic step forward in terms of that, and something that's really long overdue. I mean, for me personally, I decided to study here mostly because of the supervision and the great Irish history community, and I've been very fortunate that Edinburgh's modern Irish history community is really supportive of my research and really embraces it as part of Irish history. And I think that's something that should definitely be replicated sort of across the board, and definitely in Ireland. At the same time, as Patrick said about catching up, I do think we actually have a lot of catching up to do in terms of sort of the people who have been writing this, not just the activists who we're so indebted to. And I think particularly someone like Jeff Dudgeon is so generous with his offering of his personal history and really sharing his story as much as possible. But in recent times, I've been so encouraged and inspired by the LGBT History and I project and all of its volunteers who aren't professional historians, but their events like their history club and their online archive are really brilliant initiatives. And I know even some of their members, like Jude Copeland's doing some really interesting research on homophobic murders in the 20th century that are kind of putting historians to shame. So it's really exciting time to be doing it. And I'm fortunate in my field that those figures have been so collaborative and so generous for my own research.
I think
could I just come in there, Maurice, as well? I think that's such an important point, the voluntary nature of so much of this history, right? I mean, I'm thinking as well, like Edmund Lynch and all he's done to, record these oral histories, of over 300 plus interviews, all done voluntary as well. And I think of the likes of Kate Drennan, Judith Fenley as well, who've done some really amazing work with Queer Culture Ireland. And that's all as an aside to their day job. I mean, we're very fortunate to have these individuals, but it also is quite revealing in itself that it is a lot of voluntary work by a number of individuals.
Yeah. And I think it's such an important point, particularly, 20, 30 years, maybe 50 years time, someone will come to write a history of how this history was written. And what will be really striking will be like, when you compare this to the history of the Irish Revolution, and so much of that sources was captured by the state, right? The Bureau of Military History was a state project that saw this period as important to its formation as a state, whereas the state didn't recognize this history as important to its formation. The activists did, and they've put this in the record and on the archive in a voluntary way. And I think it's interesting, and I think it's a kind of a general statement that we can all agree on in terms of the future of this past, is that it's going to be democratic. It's going to be more democratic than many other histories, precisely because itself has emerged from the grassroots. And that's kind of something that I'm really interested in. We're getting a few questions in from audience members now, so I encourage people to jump in wherever you can. I'm going to take one question from the audience. So Wendy C. Fry's notes, she thanks us and says she finds it fascinating that one could discover more about this history by researching outside Ireland. And the question is, where else has such research been rewarding? Australia, Canada, UK, elsewhere? So where else outside of Ireland have you guys found sources or interesting kind of sidelights on the history?
One of the sources I found really useful was Gay News. The Gay News archive was really great, and particularly in documenting the earlier years. So, for example, I remember reading a report in Gay News which talked about the Legion of Mary organising meetings for homosexuals, and it was quite a funny article because it was this guy Paddy from Galway read about this particular meeting between somebody from the Campaign for Homosexual Equality had travelled to Dublin in 1973 to meet what he believed was a gay organisation. As it transpired, it was the Legion of Marys, and it was reported in Gay News. And Paddy from Galway, his title was, he wasn't impressed that they were calling the Legion of Mary a gay rights organisation. He wrote to correct it, and his letter is really great because he was like, there's not much attention to the issue of homosexuality or gay rights in Ireland, but there is quite a vibrant gay community in Ireland, and that's in 1973. So the likes of Gay News, I think, is a really good source as well. I'd be interested as well to look at maybe the archives of the International Lesbian Gay Association, and Abigail touched on something there earlier on about the transnational influences, but also I think the role that Irish gay rights organisations played on the international stage as well, I think is something worth exploring, bearing in mind that Irish activists were there in 1978 when the International Gay Association was founded, and they were very much aware of what was happening internationally. So I'd imagine that would be a good source as well. But Gay News for me was really a great source.
Mm.
Yeah, I'd agree with everything Patrick said there, and Gay News is a fantastic resource. I also think it was quite interesting. Obviously, I've been conducting research recently, so I haven't been able to go very far. But even in Scotland, the papers of the Scottish Minorities Group have an awful lot on activism in the north, and have been really enlightening in ways. And sort of have combined beautifully with a lot of the sources that I've seen from Belfast. And another thing I find quite interesting is that a lot of the northern publications, particularly in the early time, that a lot of their publications are really just kind of like a scrapbook of international press at the time. So they're a really good way of cherry picking the things that they found important and relevant to their community, and sort of reposting that for their own audience. So that's been a good way of sort of thinking beyond the geographical framework just of the island.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, it's important to look beyond the island. I think that's kind of like a mission statement of my work more broadly, and certainly the exhibition as well, is that the diaspora as well is hugely important, and movement of people is really important to activism develop. So many of the early generation of activists had London histories particularly, or histories in Britain. I was thinking also, of course, I've learned a lot from Sarah Phillips and the Trans Archives work in recovery of that history as well, in terms of how important London was in that broader story too. I guess that kind of brings me on to thinking about, what do you guys think about, what are the important tasks in terms of recovering those parts of the community that have often had less attention from historians, like the trans community, like bisexual histories, like non-binary histories, and all these different forms of sexual and gender diversity that sometimes get overlooked by the history? How do we recover those, and where are those sources to be found?
That's probably the hardest question you've asked all night. I don't know. I don't have an easy answer for that one. And again, I would add to that as well, even just those outside the major cities, right? And Abigail said that earlier on, the importance of uncovering, the provincial stories as well. I don't know, as someone who's been quite privileged in the sense that a lot of my sources and a lot of the stuff I want to look at were quite there and quite obvious. But so I don't know. I mean, I think what Sarah is doing is fantastic. It's really, really impressive. But I don't know. I think it is a challenge. And bearing in mind, I suppose the Irish Queer Archive was what established in it evolved as something that was set up in the 1970s when, those terms wouldn't have been so common, right? It being homosexual, gay, lesbian. So it is a challenge. And again, maybe it's an approach we need to look, that we don't just assume that somebody is just either gay or lesbian, and then maybe acknowledge that possibility that there could be, they're bisexual or whatever. We just almost make an assumption that, because those are the terms in use at that time, that's their identity. But, which is, again, I was making assumptions. But yeah, I don't know. It is a challenge, I think. And right now, I wouldn't really know where to start. I'd probably go to Sarah Phillips and say, how did you do it?
On that, I think oral history could be quite beneficial there, in terms of, I suppose, teasing out, especially when we're dealing with quite recent history, teasing out a lot of those subjectivities that won't be written down, and asking people more directly about their identities and that kind of stuff. I'd add to that as well, we didn't really think about something that's come up in a lot of the sources that I've read, really, is generation, and thinking about older members of the community, and how sort of they were not necessarily sometimes involved in activism, but sort of the experiences they had and how that was maybe different, because obviously they'd been around for a much longer time, and some of these causes were perhaps perceived as less relevant to them. So that's one thing I grapple with. But yeah, I mean, oral history might be a way, but I would concur with Patrick. It's a very difficult thing to start to do. And I would say that the current sort of bank of sources that we do have privilege certain perspectives that are really important in their own sense. But even in your own work, Patrick, I think you've pulled out really well the gender tensions in the movement, and sort of how different hierarchies of sort of interest in a gender. And I think that's something really important to be conscious of, sort of not seeing this as a homogenous thing, but actually thinking about all of the different experiences and identities that made up the community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's sort of the kind of trajectory of every kind of Irish history, that we begin talking about the movement, and then we begin talking about the divides, which then becomes the historiography for like 50 years. A question from Angela Cruz, who writes, I'm Canadian, only recently moved to Belfast, so I'm ignorant about the standard curricula. Is there LGBTQ plus historical content in mainstream education in primary or secondary school, north or south? And I'd add university as well to that question.
In universities, I don't know. I know there was a course in UCC in 2018, which was billed at the time as the first LGBT history course in the Republic of Ireland. I don't know if it's still moving. I would imagine, and again, I can't say this with 100% certainty, that it might maybe form part of one module in a seminar or a lecture on 20th century Ireland. But I don't think there's anyone, not that I'm aware of, that's has been researching or publishing on this history in any history department in Ireland. I would imagine it might come under a broader term of either 20th century Irish history or radical activism. And I mean, Maurice, you'd probably know better. I know you're working with schools as part of this project, but I know there was something launched earlier on in the year by it was some trade union, LGBT trade union, maybe it was INTO. They launched a kind of a course or a guide for teachers on recent Irish LGBT history. But again, that's almost just a resource as an add-on. I don't think it's actually part of the curriculum. So I don't think it is part of the curriculum down here, but I stand corrected on that.
Mm-hmm. Abigail, do you know anything about it, or even in contrast to in the UK, whether they are even in the same place?
Yeah, I was just thinking, well, even from personal experience I went to secondary school in Northern Ireland and I didn't have any LGBT history. That was relatively recently. So I'm not sure if that position has changed. But I do know that in Scotland last year it was sort of made a compulsory part of history curriculums, and that's something at secondary school level, and I think that's something that is really encouraging and should be replicated sort of everywhere. But just even from sort of my experience as a tutor at university level, a lot of my students are really engaged with this topic and really interested and want to know more. And even when I was taking tutorials on Stonewall, a lot of my students were so surprised to hear that, you know, homosexuality wasn't decriminalised in Northern Ireland until 1982. That just wasn't common knowledge to them. So I think it's something where kind of universities and schools and the institutions really need to kind of catch up to the level of interest and enthusiasm of students themselves. And I do think that's a really hopeful way of bringing this history into communities that need to hear it, and particularly for supporting LGBTQ plus youth. But yeah, I would be really encouraged and hopeful to see more of that coming forward in the coming years.
And I think that all of us as well who work on this history, whenever we're assigned to do kind of a survey course or whenever we're assigned to do a different topic, we always weave this history into the course somehow. Partly that's practical, right? Because we know about it, but also I think there's an importance, you know, it's by actually demonstrating that you can talk about LGBTQ plus history in a huge amount of topics. It's showing how that is weaved into the fabric of the national story itself. So I think that there is an importance to that, while also we should also make the case for having something like an LGBTQ plus history, having more specific LGBTQ plus history modules in Irish universities, and also maybe even building up to kind of what you have in like Goldsmiths, where you have specific courses as well designed around it. A comment from Hannah Tune, just to note that there are some copies of UK-based bi-publications in the IQA dating from the late 90s and noughties. Yeah, so that's, I mean, that IQA is just an endlessly fascinating source of material. And I guess thinking about it as well, where, you know, not even undergrads may seem daunted in terms of telling them, you can go to the National Library, you can get a reader's ticket, you can hold this material in your hand. And I'm wondering, how do we, as academics who are used to this and treat it as every day, democratize access to these materials? And I guess kind of go out and tell people, you know, you can work with this and you can work on this and you don't need to have done a 4-year PhD. Anyone can access national materials. Do we just go out and say it? I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I remember when I first went to the National Library of Ireland, I was a little bit daunted by it. It's such a big building. It's an amazing building. But I suppose, yeah, I mean, one of the things that I suppose that I have with the IQA, so it's in Dublin, right? So unless you can get up there and get access to it, especially now with COVID, and that's why I think, you know, that what Orla Egan has done with the Cork LGBT Archive is great in terms of accessibility, right? Particularly when I was in Florence, to be able to go online there and access that. So I do think we need to maybe think about it that as well, and trying to maybe digitize these things as well, so they are more accessible, that you don't have to travel all the way up to Dublin to access these things. But also, again, to recognize some of the other collections beyond the IQA. Like, I mean, I'm hoping sooner rather than later they'll start to make David Norris's papers accessible, because there's some really great material in there as well. I know Father Bernard Lynch has recently donated his archive there as well, and that'll be a really amazing source. Kieran Rose, there's so much there. I mean, fair play to them if they get around to cataloguing it all. There's an awful lot there still to be done. But I think the likes of what you're doing as well, Maurice, is really important to get these sources and material out there as well. This public history that you're doing and leading on is great. And it brings it to life rather than, just it's seeing the catalogue on the NLI. So I'd like to see more exhibitions like that personally, just where people can see it and learn a bit more about it.
And one thing as well I wanted to ask about, related to the idea of public visibility, is if I gave you funding for a plaque or a memorial or even a statue, what would you put up? And where would you put it?
I'll jump in on that, because I think what Patrick did with the quilts was a really beautiful tribute and something really important. And there's nothing like that in the North, and it would be so wonderful to see. Obviously, the AIDS situation is unique in both places, but I would love to see something like that people can sort of go to. And I think, Patrick, you're very right about sort of making these things real. Just on sort of the previous point, I think part of the problem with a lot of the sources I use is that they are closed records. So a lot of the activist records in the North are, you need special permission to see them. But I will add that sort of the Leadenhall Library's Divided Society is an online archive. So there are some quite good, not all of them, but quite easily accessible. Anyone could go on and look at them if you just create an account with them. They have some quite good gay publications and posters and things there. Also, to add to that, Jeff Dudgeon's website is fantastic. He's got a really wonderful sort of personal archive of different speeches that he's written and photographs and things like that I haven't found anywhere else. So yeah, I would say in terms of public history in the North, we're really only just getting started, and there's a lot to do. Even I found quite interesting, like UB, they've been doing the LGBTQ plus history walking tours, and I think that's a really valuable way of engaging people and making it sort of come to life for them. So I think there's loads of scope for it. And even sort of, we were talking, I know, in the preparation about like dramatization and using culture and media to engage people. Just thinking about even recently in the UK, something like It's a Sin started so many conversations that I hadn't had with people before, that really engaged them with history and sort of starting to ask questions of things that they hadn't before.
Maurice, would you let me split the funds and buy 2 plaques? Could I have 2 plaques?
You can have 2 plaques. I'll give you 2.
Okay, 2 plaques. So yeah, I mean, one of the organizations that I think definitely deserves greater recognition would be Gay Health Action, and it goes back to what Abigail was saying is the work that they did in the 1980s was absolutely phenomenal, right? And I think the state owes them a debt of gratitude, because without them, God only knows how much worse the situation might have been in Ireland. They really did tremendous work. And again, as a proud culture, I would give the second plaque to Maurice Walsh and the Galway Gay Collective. What Maurice did in the early 1980s to create a space for individuals in the west of Ireland to meet. She's far too modest to acknowledge that work, but the very idea that there would be an advertisement in the 1980s for a gay group, I would imagine was quite empowering for some individuals in those regions to know, one, that they're not the only person out there like that, and that they could reach out to this organization. So my second plaque would go to Maurice, because she really did pave the way for later efforts in Galway, and Nuala Ward will pay tribute to Maurice as well, and John Porter. Maurice wasn't alone, but Maurice did a lot of the heavy lifting there. So they're my 2 plaques, and yeah.
That felt very Desert Island Discs in a way. Thanks, Patrick. Well, if there's someone listening in who has the power and the authority, it would be great, because I do think we need more of this kind of history just visible on the kind of streetscape. There's a question from Hannah Chin for Abigail. Do the majority of your students who are engaging with LGBTQ plus history generally identify as LGBTQ plus or heterosexual?
That's a really interesting question. I think actually on a broad level, all of them are. So I have been teaching on Stonewall specifically, but I've sort of used it as a good way of shoehorning my own stuff in and making them think about Ireland, which I do tend to do with most of my topics. But I don't necessarily know how they identify. I wouldn't be able to sort of quantify that. But I think it is a general topic that does engage history undergraduates at university level. And that's something that we should sort of reflect on what we're teaching them.
I think it is a way of kind of diversifying public history audiences and bringing in younger people into public history discussions. I think these kind of histories of diversity in Ireland are just, there's a huge audience there for them that's not necessarily served by a lot of kind of, I guess you might call like paperback history topics like the Irish Revolution and so on. So I do think that, yeah, it is a history that draws in everyone in a way. So I think we're coming to an end, coming to a close. So if there's any last questions from the audience, do get them in. If there's any suggestions for plaques, throw them in as well in there into the chat. But I think that, yeah, so I think we'll bring things to a close then, because I don't think we have any more questions to the audience. So I am sorry that we can't go for post-event pints. That would be lovely, but hopefully the next time. And do you both have any other events that you'd like to shout out? I know myself and Patrick will be on another panel on December 2nd at Maynooth University. So in many ways, we'll be continuing some of these conversations in that panel. So if anyone's interested, I'd encourage them to check out that event. Abigail, do you have anything coming up that you'd like to shout out?
Unfortunately, quite a lot of academic events that won't be publicised on the internet, but I do think I should use the opportunity, sort of, because Patrick and I are both here, to mention actually just as sort of an assessment of the state of the field, that we're both co-convening alongside Sean Brady a workshop to be held here at Edinburgh next July on the theme of Ireland sexualities and history, and we do have a Twitter page for that I'm happy to circulate afterwards. But that for us has been a really encouraging project in terms of how many people from how many places are really working on these topics, and just how much research is being done. I think it's something, sometimes it can feel very much like it is something that is sidelined in whatever university department or etc. But that's been a really heartening experience for both of us. I think I can say that there's just the wealth of research coming forward and how many different topics there are. I think bodes very well for the future of Ireland's LGBTQ plus past in that sense.
Patrick, you don't want to chime in on anything else? Well, actually, how can I buy, and members of the audience, purchase your book? That's a question for you.
Good question. I'm having issues because of Brexit with the book, but if you go on, I have an email address actually, maybe I'll get it out here really quickly. If people email academicsalesuk@bloomsbury.com, and if you enter in the code activism21UK, you'll get 35% off. You can go to bloomsbury.com. If you're based in the UK, you'll have no issues. It's just at the moment they're not shipping to EU, but Amazon will have it as well. But I mean, if you go with this Bloomsbury email address, you'll save 35%. Hopefully there'll be a launch at some stage if I can get my hands on the book itself. But yeah, Brexit for you.
Well, thanks, Patrick. I recommend everyone to pick it up. Make a great Christmas present for all. And that just leaves me to thank our brilliant speakers, Patrick and Abigail, and also to thank everyone who tuned in. So that's all from me, and hope you all have a very pleasant December and Christmas and all the run up to that mayhem and chaos, and enjoy the toy show tomorrow night. Bye, everyone.